before we take questions or maybe of reactions from the rest of the panel, I think the point you made is important, that relationships with gatekeeper countries, transit countries, is a complement to our own efforts to control illegal immigration, not a substitute. And I think under the Trump administration, it was approached as a complement. In other words, the administration domestically was doing what it could to limit illegal immigration, and then asked Mexico to, and to some degree the Northern Triangle countries, to help out, basically to row in the same direction.
Correct.
And what I think the Biden administration has done for 2 years is say, domestically, we're not going to do anything to limit illegal immigration, but we expect you, Mexico, to stop it for us.
It's the same
and they're
thing
not going to do
It's the same thing on energy. They're stopping domestic energy production and going around the world asking Saudi Arabia and Venezuela to pump more oil.
Right,
It's a very similar dynamic.
So we'll take questions. I have a whole list of questions myself, and I did pay for the microphone. But nonetheless, I'll see if anybody has questions. Jessica?
Thank you. Thank you all for your insight and analysis. Really very interesting. I have a question for Victor. Being a gatekeeper country does also seem to provide some opportunity for what you might call blackmail. Can you comment a little bit on how you think that can be dealt with?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Collecting question. Okay, yeah. Of course, and they are doing this. It's Turkey is doing this when they opened the border just before the COVID-19 pandemic, February 2020. But also Morocco did it when it was 8,000 illegal migrants to cross within half an hour to the Spanish enclave. So it's definitely there. So. And we should mention another, I didn't want to mention too much definition, but other term, the stabilocracies, which are outer stabilocracies. It's a new term in the literature which describe stable countries. Stable, this is the first one. Stabilocracies or autocracies, authoritarian regimes, which, keeping this. And it's constant blame that which are the countries that the European Union is supporting as a gatekeepers in the Assisi government or the Erdogan government, whether we are sacrificing our democratic values and norms supporting this kind of regime. So it's definitely on the table. This is why I suggest that shifting from this carrot and stick policy, which has its certain limits. We could see in the change in the administration in the White House. Then suddenly Mexico realized that some states didn't want to maintain the Remain Mexico anymore for family units, etc., etc. So it's always complicating and a very, very quickly changing situation. So to shifting from this to this, let's say, win-win situation, because Mexico, as I mentioned, and Mexican people don't want the country to become a parking lot. And reacting to the excellencies, let's say, critics and ideas. When we visited the human sector at the end of March with the border tour, they mentioned that I think 130 different citizens were there.
Different countries.
From different countries, yeah, sorry. And I think it's also the part of the gatekeeper story that with how many states can you make a deal? In how many countries can you try to handle the root causes? And just you mentioned Ecuador, Nicaragua, other countries. If you make a deal with Ecuador, perhaps then the pattern will shift. I don't know to the people going to Brazil or Colombia, etc., etc. So. Actually, the gatekeeper issue is also about the story to make negotiation and the deal not with dozens of different countries, but 1, 2, 3 maximum. And in this context, I think the United States is an excellent position, ladies and gentlemen, because Mexico is the gatekeeper country. In the case of the European Union, it's much more complicated. We are surrounding dozens of different countries. and they're utilizing their potential. We could see in 21 in the Belarusian crisis when they weaponized migration. So this is, I think also a strong point of the argumentation that in this context, you have to concentrate on one country. And you can offer a solution for these countries, not the remainder of Mexico, because as Excellence mentioned, it's a burden for Mexico. But for example, providing protection for if there is openness, of course, from Mexico City, for the protection of the southern border of Mexico, perhaps it can be a much easier story.
There's a question back there.
Yes, this is for Nicolette. You mentioned the financial aid that Turkey receives for the refugee program, and I know you had mentioned help from the EU. Are there any other entities that are assisting with the refugee program, or that have assisted with the refugee program in Turkey?
Of course, there are a lot of different actors, so international organizations and countries outside of the EU. So there are a lot of countries and organizations supporting refugees in Turkey. But I think the EU is the biggest donor in this sense. So this more than 9 billion euros, I think it's the biggest contribution.
I think actually that's an interesting point, because the UN, for instance, and we've written about some of this with regard to the flow coming north into the toward the U.S. border, the UN actually facilitates the flow of illegal migration to the United States. I mean, they're giving out, money to illegal immigrants. They're funding, we've written about this, it's on our site at cis.org. They're funding psychological assistance where third country migrants, Central America mostly, apply for asylum in Mexico as a kind of temporary expedient. They get rejected. Then they go and visit these psychiatrists or psychologists, and then they do recovered memory therapy where they realize, no, really, they were persecuted. They just forgot about it. And then they go and go back. And this is all UN funded. We were just, as Victor mentioned, we were on a border tour. We went from San Diego to Yuma and back, and we visited Mexicali. We were there for a day, visited several migrant shelters, which are themselves funded by various UN-affiliated organizations. So to your question, it's not, sure, there's a role, it seems to me, for multinational or supranational organizations to assist migrant flow, but for the most part, it certainly ideologically, and even just as a practical matter, what they're doing is actually facilitating or accelerating the flow, not interfering with it. Was there another question? Yeah.
Well, I have a question concerning the different domestic dynamic within the United States versus Europe. I mean, in some sense, we know in the United States who it is who takes a dim view of immigration enforcement and thus doesn't want to pressure third countries. It's much of the Democratic Party, the business interests in the United States, and so forth. And so it seems to me that that's the fundamental question for the United States. We could get the cooperation of these countries, but we'd have to push them. And at present, this regime and the coalition it represents has very little interest in actually threatening trade or foreign aid and things like that. But what I don't have a sense is, in Europe, what is it? What is the domestic? Is there a domestic constituency of people, maybe not in Hungary, but in the rest of the EU, who feel like, look, it doesn't really matter if 1 million people come illegally here. We need workers. We're an aging population, or they see them as just humanitarian migrants. So does Europe seems to be able to not have a fundamental flip in policy. So Trump saw it as a priority. Biden sees it as not important at all to enforce the law. And so, but in Europe, it seems like I'm kind of curious. I just don't understand. What are the interest groups that would play out here a little bit? Can you give us some more? I just don't know, and I'd like to know.
Okay, thank you for the question, Steve. I think the fundamental difference between the whole concept of immigration between the United States and the European Union, that actually since the beginning as I know, the immigration to the United States was actually a labor issue. So these people arrived and they started to climbing in the hiring lane, slowly. And still now it's more or less the case. And of course, there are many aspects of the story that Roy Beck wrote on the how it's affect the Afro-American population, the job potential, etc. But my impression is it's not a question that if you are arriving to the United States, as soon as possible, you have to find something some place to work. In the European Union and in Europe in general, I think there was a huge shift in the late 80s, early 90s, when by the 60s, 70s, it was also a labor issue. In the 90s, it shifted to a humanitarian issue. Letting people from civil war areas, persecuted people, escaping from genocide. And the main focus was a humanitarian focus, which meant that we have to provide them shelter, education, food, etc. And the whole story of labor force participation, integration into labor market, it was a secondary or third in this context. And I think we made a huge mistake in this story because, in Europe, it's still a big challenge. You arrive, you apply for asylum, the time also years while you get a final decision. And in most cases, you don't have the right to work, which is completely other story what's going in the United States, mainly after the Trump decision that even you are let's say illegal immigrant and waiting what will be your story, you get the working permission here. So actually, what's the consequence of this policy? That there are huge communities in all around of Europe, mainly Western Europe, who are on the social benefits. Even they don't have the possibility to work, even if they want, because there's no work authorization for them. And in the 90s or early 20s, it seems that it's okay, some thousands and tens of thousands, it's okay. But now it's hundreds of thousands of people, generation of new kids, alienated from the European societies, and there's no real possibility or idea how to drive them back to the labor market. They, as we discussed, they're out of the labor market. And who's arrived now? There's no real expectation that they are going to work. It was the big idea in 2015 that 1 million people arrived to Germany. They will solve all problems. But these people are not coming, to Guatemala, Honduras, have the family connection, places where they know if I go there, I will get some job, perhaps illegal or great job, but I will get. Syrians arrive, no connections, no any idea how, don't speak the language, very, very different culture. And still now, half of the people who arrived in 2015 out of the labor market. So it means, and after 8 years, the chances, it's very, very limited.
I had a question regarding that sort of expands on the gatekeeper country idea, and I'd like to hear people's reactions. Denmark, if you followed this, did something that they don't call it, but I call it remain in Rwanda. So that if you come in there, they would literally send you to Rwanda. And the difference was you weren't applying for asylum in Denmark, but waiting in Rwanda. They sent you to Rwanda and you could apply for asylum in Rwanda. And the Australians tried the same kind of thing where they put people on several islands of other countries and said, you're not getting to Australia. Cambodia's agreed to take your asylum requests. That's a sort of different, that's part of sort of a gatekeeper approach, but one that doesn't have the limitations that you would refer to, Chris, in Remain in Mexico. But presumably a little harder to twist the arms of a country to agree to do that because, then you actually are sending people there to those countries. Any thoughts on this, the Danish approach and the Australian approach in this regard? Anyone have any thoughts?
Yeah, and then again, me, sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, because, I'm Africanist, so I a little bit know about the background, and not only the Danish deal, but also the UK Rwanda deal. Ladies and gentlemen, again, if you have the possibility that paying 10,000 euro or dollar for a very risky trip to reach Europe, and you have the possibility that you will be sent back or sent to Rwanda, because most people love Rwanda, you will consider it not twice, but 3 or 4 times whether you invest this huge chunk of money for the journey. And the second issue, ladies and gentlemen, also just to know the internal dynamic of African politics. If a European capital calling, I don't know, Abuja, that, okay, there is 20,000 Nigerian arrived illegally, there's no right to stay, please accept them back. Abuja said, oh no, how you can prove that they are Nigerian, there's no passports, oh no, actually the weather is very bad, Abuja, so deportation flights can come, so no. But if Paul Kagame, who is the leading personality, even it's a very controversial personality in African politics, if he raises phone and, come on, I will send back 10,000 of your fellow citizens. Okay, just send it, okay. Sorry to say, but it's how politics is working in Africa. It's very important. The big problem with the deal is, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the progressive development of EU law and whole European law, that it's definitely illegal, we should say it. Because according the European refugee and asylum law, which much more progressive than the Geneva Convention, which was implemented of course the EU corpus, but was extended, each person has the right to apply asylum in the territory of the certain states if he reached it or she reached it. This is why Hungary also under the court of the European Union, because there's currently no possibility to apply asylum in the territory of Hungary, only in the consulate of Belgrade. So, and this is the problem. Even the British Minister of Interior confessed that yes, likely it's against international law to make these, to outsource this refugee, asylum procedure to Rwanda. Even if it's very funny, that last sentence, that the regulation and the agreement was attacked that Rwanda is not a safe third country and the asylum system is weak, blah, blah, blah. Why the United Nations, the UNHCR, has an agreement with Rwanda bringing people from Libyan detention centers to Rwanda. And I understand that UK and Libya is very different. But if Rwanda is considered that the refugee system is underdeveloped and the country is not safe, that how is possible that people coming from Libya, for them is enough safe, coming from UK is not enough safe? So, no.
Yeah, I mean, I don't dispute the question. I mean, yeah. Chris had pointed out that, why should you even anyone passing through Mexico be allowed to apply for asylum? The fact is the law allows it, and the law, prevents in Europe sending people to Rwanda. The question is, would the policy work? And it seems to me, and that it relates to the question of aid and money, because a lot of countries, I mean, let's face it, they're run by one person or a small elite. If you bribe the right person, then you can get a country to agree. I mean, just to pick an example, and I have no idea how Cambodia is run, but if you deposit $50 million into the right person's Swiss bank account, the country will become much more cooperative. And it seems to me, this is real politic, and we need to stop pussyfooting around. So we'll take one last question from the back.
Yeah, excellent panel. We get a context on the European Union's Remain in Turkey policy and how it is actually heavily financed by European powers, the EU. But as Nicola mentioned, nevertheless, there is growing resentment in Turkey to this policy that keeps these people in the country, and with all the disruption that inevitably comes with that. And then Ambassador Landau gave us great insights on Mexico, and my question really goes to Mexico. It would seem that the very fact that the White House policy, the administration's policy, allures hundreds of thousands of people into Mexico, already embattled with criminal cartels and other sorts of serious challenges, sovereignty challenges. The Mexicans are very famous for defending their sovereignty vis-a-vis Washington. They seem to complain not at all publicly. López Obrador, in the policy discussions, the so-called security discussions between Washington and Mexico, they're not asking for money that I've read about. They're not even complaining about Mayorkas's policies that have deposited hundreds of thousands of people from outside the continent in their country. Why is that? What should Americans understand about what's going on in Mexico that brings about such a lay-down policy?
That's a great question, and certainly it was. I think it just kind of goes back to the cultural roots of migration in Mexico, that I think Mexico still has a pretty strong self-image as a source of migrants, and I don't think they have kind of come around to a way of thinking for the 21st century that their role now is much more likely to be as a transit point for migrants. And I think that was one of my challenges as ambassador, to kind of say to Mexico, please, you have to update your thinking in a sense that this is a huge challenge to your own sovereignty. We saw that during COVID when control over your borders became something that everybody was doing. Mexico was one of the only countries in the world that, even at the height of the pandemic, never restricted any flights from anywhere in the world. New York City, Milan, when those cities were really in the midst of the pandemic, there is still something in Mexican way of thinking about these issues that is kind of reflexively pro-migrant, open borders. Again, I think that will change. I think that's more maybe the Mexican political elite is still somewhat behind public sentiment. I think it is just hard for Mexico. It's like having cognitive dissonance or an out-of-body experience. Why should we care more about illegal migration than the United States? I just think they haven't wrapped their heads around that. But I think they should, because whatever our policies are, the impact on Mexico is going to be dramatic. And so, I think if we have an open borders policy that's enticing and luring in migrants from all over the world to come through Mexico, you would think Mexico would be concerned about it. So I agree with your question. It is somewhat surprising. I think that will change. And I think it's important for the United States to engage Mexico on these issues.
And I think it's interesting that Mexico does seem to have a similar disconnect between its leadership class and its public view on immigration as we have here, because when the flow of Central Americans got pretty significant, remember this was a number of years ago, there was actually a protest in Tijuana against all these Central Americans who were coming through. And the mayor at that time, who was politically kind of embattled, saw this as an opportunity, printed up a red baseball cap that said, "Make Tijuana Great Again,"
right.
and went to the protest against the Mexican popular protest against the flow of Central Americans through Tijuana.
I think the one thing is, and this kind of maybe answers your question, I think for Mexico, they see the answer to this not as necessarily protesting all the people coming into their country, but just shipping them off to the United States as quickly as possible. And so in a sense, I think that is the safety valve now, that they don't have to worry about massive, about like what the Turkey situation is. I think as long as the United States is willing to receive them, in a sense, that's the easiest out for Mexico, just to immediately facilitate the transportation to the border and kind of make it our problem.
Well, thank you for everybody on the panel. Something I probably should have said at the beginning, but it kind of occurred to me as we were talking. In the American context, when we talk about Gatekeeper, we think of Operation Gatekeeper, which was in the 1990s a major Border Patrol initiative in the San Diego area to actually stop illegal immigrants from crossing, which is a radical idea, apparently. The interesting point, though, is that term, Operation Gatekeeper, assumed that the Border Patrol was sort of the first resort in stopping people from getting across, whereas the whole theme of our discussion here of gatekeeper countries is, in a sense, that the Border Patrol should be the last resort, and that the point is to reduce, in a sense, sort of through attrition, reduce the number of people who actually get to the Border Patrol by cooperating agreements with foreign countries and changing the calculation of incentives and payoffs, because as Victor said, you're not going to pay tens of thousands of dollars and take all of this risk just to end up in Rwanda. And so I think that it is in the U.S. Discussion of this, we need to stop thinking of the Border Patrol agent as the first resort in stopping illegal immigration, and rather think of him or her as the last resort, sort of the final person. After we've done everything else, that amount of illegal immigration that, despite all of that, has still come through, then the Border Patrol agent's job comes into
I agree with that, and
play.
I think I might disagree with Victor a little bit on this point. That I think even looking to Mexico as the gatekeeper, I think is problematic, because if somebody's already in Mexico, we have a 2,000-mile border with Mexico. Right. I think we need to think about, and we also have a very complicated relationship with Mexico that involves security issues, economic issues. There's a lot on the table. I think countries like Costa Rica, Panama, I think it's a much simpler thing to say, that's where we got to really stop them. It shouldn't. The weight should not always be only on Mexico.
Right. And as Victor said, in referencing Niger, it doesn't have to be countries right next door, even for Europeans.
Right.
Okay. Well, I'm going to respect people's time. Thank you, Victor and Nicolette and Chris, for coming in. This video will be on our website, cis.org. We're also going to have the PowerPoints that we saw, and I welcome all of you to tune in or come in person even to future events. We do these kind of things pretty frequently. Thanks for tuning in or showing up in person, and hope you come in next time.